Welcome everyone to yet another insightful session conducted by Caucus, the discussion forum of Hindu College, on the topic The Economics of Biodiversity. Today we are joined by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, who is the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. His distinguished career has focused on economics of poverty and nutrition, environmental economics, economic of measurement, and the economics of knowledge. Professor Das Gupta has played a pivotal role in shaping the global conversation on sustainable development and the responsible use of our natural resources. His groundbreaking work, The Economics of Biodiversity, the Das Gupta Review, a comprehensive report commissioned by the UK government in 2019, laid the foundation for natural capital accounting. In recognition of his immense contribution to ecological economics, Professor Sir Dasgupta has knighted, was knighted in the 2002 birthday honors and was further honored with the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the British Empire (GBE) in the 2023 New Year honors. We are incredibly fortunate to have Professor Sir Dasgupta join this session. We hope to have a meaningful and thought provoking discourse with a scholar who has profoundly shaped our understanding of environmental sustainability. Now, I'd like to call upon the president of our society, Pushkar Pandey, to introduce our society and go further with the discussion.
Thank you very much, Suhani. So, the structure for today's discussion is that it will be a moderated discussion based on a set of questions that we have prepared. And then if time permits, we are going to open the discussion to the floor in case the audience has any questions, in case time permits. So about Caucus, I'll try to be as brief as I can. Caucus was formed in 2007 as a society meant for discussing foreign affairs and international relations. And gradually the recognition that everything is interconnected in economics, political science, history, science, technology, innovation, and so on, led to us exploring other subjects as well extensively. And we hosted a lot of scholars in the previous semester, and in this semester, the even semester, we are extremely privileged to have with us Professor Dasgupta with us. And I'll start without any further ado with our first question. So Professor Dasgupta, two aspects of your childhood strike out. Its peripatetic nature in the tragic aftermath of India's partition, and the vibrant intellectual background of your family, given the eminence of your father, Professor Omiyo Kumar Dasgupta. So could you tell us a bit about the formative factors of your life which molded you and your intellectual disposition up to when you started, say, undergraduate education?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you after all these correspondence we have had over the internet. I'm pleased to be here, and I was too young, I think, to have experienced the partition. We were certainly, my father was a lecturer at the University of Dhaka for a long while, and we left in 1946. I was too young to feel the circumstances. Sort of vague memories, I guess, sort of long train journey through parts of India. But it's may be influenced by what I heard later on rather than direct experience. So I can't say I experienced anything of the trauma of the partition, which so many people experienced on both sides as they're moving. But the second part of your question, which is to do with my upbringing, I guess, I mean, I'm fantastically privileged. My father was a profound thinker, and one forgets that it didn't come natural to him. He was born in a very poor family, so it was he had to work hard at becoming the great thinker that he was. It wasn't bestowed on him. But being raised in his household was, of course, and my mother's household, the two were incredibly complementary to each other. without my mother, he would have been nothing, and without him, she would have been far less influential. Um, the great thing about it was, quite apart from the fact that I had an edge over most people in being brought up in a rational Enlightenment environment, is that from a very early age, I got to meet some of the most profound minds in India at that time. When I say at that time, I mean the 50s, late 50s or so. Now, I also had great advantage of having a sister who was 5 years older than me, but about 15 years brighter than me. So she had a great influence on me, because she was a real student. She was brilliant and also great scholarly. So I used to mimic her, ape her rather. If she was reading something, I would look at that book and see whether I could get something out of it. So that influence was fantastic. So I met, at a very early age, I used to listen to my father speaking to, having conversations with such people as Satyan Bose, D.P. Mukherjee. These were giants of their time. I don't know if you've heard of any of them, but Bose you probably have, but D.P. Mukherjee in the sociological side of things, B.N. Ganguly, V.K. R.V. Rao, these were people who came and visited our home quite regularly. Sachin Chaudhary, founder of the Economic and Political Weekly, was one of my father's closest friends. So I guess I was raised in a household where intellectual, academic pursuit was routine. So that must have had a huge influence on me. But actually, a second influence on my development, I guess, for whatever what it's worth, was 2 years I spent in one of the great schools of India. I mean, of anywhere. I can't think of a better school than the one I went to, which was Rajghat School in Varanasi. That's where my father was a professor, so I went there between the ages of 13 and 15. So it was a sort of a secondary school that I went to. And that had a profound influence on me. It was a exceptional atmosphere. It was founded by Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti. And I had very inspiring teachers.
So, one aspect of your father's work that I came across was the history of economic ideas. So, his work titled Epochs of Economics Theory. Could you tell us a bit more about his work in this area? Because when we look at practicing economists, it seems to us that they are not that concerned about the history of economic thought. Just like a physicist wouldn't study the Principia Mathematica directly and just learn a few condensed formula of what Newton worked with. But could you tell us a bit about his work in the history of economic thought and how you have approached the history of economic thought in your life?
It's a hard one, because I didn't really follow my father's footsteps. First of all, I should remind you that I should mention that I don't really have a degree in undergraduate degree in economics. I know very little economics, in fact, because my undergraduate work, right up to the pre-PhD level, was in mathematics here. And I was influenced by the late James Mirrlees, who had also moved from maths to economics, and he suggested in my final year in maths, as it happened, why don't you work on mathematical economics problems? And so he became my supervisor, arranged financial assistance so that I could make the transfer to the economics department as a PhD student. So my background in economics is rather minimal, and I still don't really know the subject well, because I never really had a formal training in it. And even less so the history of economic thought. I know very little, other than through my father's writings. Now, I think what was distinctive about him was his work was that, as I see it, as I read it, was that he traced systems of economic thought to the contemporary economic and social problems that the writers had faced. So he tracked theory to the time at which the body of thought was being created, to the circumstances, which is one reason, even though he was a great scholar of the history of thought, he never suggested to me that I should read it, the history of economic thought, because he felt that if as a theorist, I ought to be working on problems that the world faces today rather than the ones that they faced 200 years ago. So I think he was extremely encouraging in my own work when I moved to economics and I started. And unfortunately, he was alive until I think he died in 1992. By then, I established myself, I guess, in the sense that I had a chair in Cambridge by then. So he saw me here, and he had actually he was a very interesting person. He suddenly reminded me of a question that you just now asked, to give you something of his sense of his personality. So you can see why I sort of have a very warm feelings towards my upbringing. So all these, right through my early stages of my life, I'd heard what a great place Cambridge was from my father. He used to think that Cambridge was a great center of learning. And of course, two of our good friends, my brother-in-law, I.G. Patel, he'd gone to Cambridge and did his PhD there, and Amartya Sen was a student of my father's and a family friend, and he'd gone to Cambridge and done his PhD. So I'd heard a lot about the place and thought that that my father, of course, he had a great deal of affection for the place and respect. So when I was a professor at the LSE, at the time I was offered the chair at Cambridge. This was back in 1983, I guess. So I wrote to my father. In those days, email wasn't there. I just wrote him a letter, said that I've been offered this chair and I've accepted it. And thinking that he's going to write me a letter saying how pleased he is, and the usual filial letter that you might expect for somebody who has admired the place you're going to take up a chair in. And there were not very many chairs there at that time. Nothing of the sort. The letter I got was, yes, of course, they've done the right thing, but are you sure you want to go there? Because the history of people moving from the LSE to Cambridge, he wrote, is not very encouraging. And it started with my father-in-law, James Mead, and he said, well, he went to Cambridge from, I think he must have been the LSE. Yes, he was at the LSE. And he said, well, his best work was done by then. So it was a very, I was really touched by that, because it suggested that he thought my work was good and that I shouldn't jeopardize it. In the event, of course, I came to Cambridge, and I like to think some of my best work has been done since then.
There are two aspects of that response that really intrigued me. The first is, of course, the intellectual trajectory. So you studied physics at Hansraj based on the information that
Yes.
I've seen online. And then you studied mathematics
Yeah.
at the undergraduate level in Cambridge. While in Delhi, Delhi and Bengal have often been juxtaposed with each other. So Delhi is the center of power, but Bengal, since the Bengal Renaissance with Presidency and Calcutta University, have been a parallel intellectual milieu in themselves. And Presidency produced economists like Amartya Sen and Shukamai Chakravarti, as well. So what sort of a distinction do you think operated at that time between, let's say, the intellectual environment in Bengal and the sort of economists it produced, and the intellectual trajectory that you went through when you studied physics at Hansraj before studying mathematics and then proceeding?
Well, it's a bit slightly hard question for me to answer, because I wasn't in the Calcutta milieu at all. I like to think that was an advantage for me, actually, because I'm not a great admirer of the trend of the educational trends in the Presidency College of the 1950s. From what I saw as an aftermath, there was a certain amount of role playing, I've always felt, in the discourse. They're all sort of, there was a kind of a fashion to be Marxists, I guess, of the 1950s. And because none of them would actually acknowledge being a Marxist. They would say, well, I'm not a Marxist, but I read. I mean, he's a great scholar, so I must read him. So I sort of think, well, I come from a different tradition altogether. I'm a mathematician, not an economist. So I can't really say what inspired. But remember, these people are also by economic standard, a generation older than me, Shukumai and Martha, so I shouldn't really give you a sense that I understood the milieu that they were, that generation had experienced than I did. In any case, I came from maths, and again in Delhi, so very different. But the advantages of having done maths in Delhi as opposed to economics and presidency college, I guess, for my purposes, I mean, of course, it worked very well for most of these people. I'm not suggesting anything of comparative virtues. It's just that it wouldn't have suited me. I was very unsure of, for example, in current affairs, I was quite ignorant of current affairs. If math students or physics students are singularly, at least my generation, was singularly uninterested in current affairs. One reason I moved to economics was I was gradually getting much more engaged as a student in Cambridge over the Vietnam War. And so I wanted to understand, I guess, social processes, sort of naturally driven to those or drawn to them to try and understand them. So I moved to economics. So I think to answer your question, I can't really give you a very sensible answer about the differences in the background. I can only infer what was going on in Calcutta at the time I was in Delhi. Subsequently, when I met colleagues, one of my closest friends in Cambridge was a brilliant, great economist, Amit Baduri, who came from the Presidency College, Calcutta, and he and I were, I mean, he influenced me a great deal of my social education in economics subsequently. But I can't, my training was so different. We physicists and mathematicians that came at Delhi at my time anyway, were far less politically conscious than the economists coming out of Calcutta. I think that would be a reasonable way of distinguishing the two milieu.
So, since you mentioned that your a significant part of your education up to the PhD level was in mathematics, it reminds me of how Milton Friedman once argued in the methodology of positive economics that, all right, the economists come up with neat models which may have assumptions that are not reasonable, but as long as they yield predictable results, we should be fine with it. There's this tendency of quote unquote physics envy, a term that's used sometimes to describe social scientists who try to come up with neat models, is something that he defended. How do you view, let's say, this tendency to reduce economics to a very objective and mathematics oriented, modeling oriented subject, let's say, as opposed to some of the ideology driven milieu that you described was prevalent in presidency of those times? How do you distinguish between this attempt to make economics a very hyper objective subject and the recognition that, all right, there is an ideological driver as well to it?
Well, that's a very deep question you've asked, and I can't really do any justice to it, largely because I'm not a philosopher of science or philosopher of economics. I have spent some time thinking about methodological problems. But first of all, I think my first gut reaction to your question is that I think we make too much of this subjective distinction. Just because you're writing down a mathematical model doesn't mean that you haven't got a philosophical attitude to the problem, or that you don't have value system. Of course you do. The very choice of the model that you wish to work on gives you some coloring of the background that you come from, or how you see the world, how you'd like to. The fact, writing down a mathematical model of a local local community, for example, of how the processes are at work between, say, peasants and the natural world in which the peasants are operating, doesn't mean that suddenly you become a physics envy or anything like that. Economics is by definition, by its nature, a quantitative subject. Absolutely, everything is measurable. Otherwise, you're doing literature. You're looking at commodities, and they're measurable in terms of volume or weight or mass, and exchanges are taking place, which are giving you rates at which transactions are taking. This is a very naturally mathematical subject. So the issue of whether you should do it mathematically or not seems to be a non-issue. You have to be, because it's a quantitative subject. Now the question is that I think deep down what your question is, what some people feel, that perhaps the mathematical models are far too brittle to handle the complexity of the situation. But that is true in any subject. The moment you try and articulate a system of relationships that might be governing the process that you are studying, you've already narrowed it down. If you think Marx didn't narrow it down, you're wrong. Everybody narrows it down by definition. And then there is a hidden mathematical model, because the subject is quantitative. People are exchanging goods and services at certain such rates. Okay, whether it's a market or a non-market exchange, doesn't matter. So it's inevitably a mathematical subject. The question is, do you make it a fetish of it, or does it take place sort of organically? I like to think the best economics that is done comes where the mathematics comes organically from the questions that you were asking, and the art of good modeling is to whittle down from this vast, complex system into something that is manageable. The kinds of people who I admire most in my subject would be people like Kenneth Arrow and the late Robert Solow. These people were extremely wide-ranging social thinkers, but they whittle down things to a manageable level. And then if you say something is missing, then they will say, yes, of course, lots of things are missing in the model that I've constructed. But if you'd like to introduce them, go ahead. But for my purposes, that's what I did. And because otherwise you just simply sort of throw up your hand and saying everything is connected with everything else and everything is influences everything else. And at the end of it, you get mush. You don't get anything sensible. So look, modeling is more as much a science as it is an art. And your intuitions are going to guide you towards a model constructing a model which you think is capturing the process that you're trying to study. And it's always a ceteris paribus kind of assumption at the background. You're saying other things equal, this is how the process is working. And if somebody questions it and say, well, no, other things aren't equal, then say, well, tell me how to introduce the thing which is not equal, and then elaborate on it. But the more you elaborate the model, the less you will understand the workings. That's the problem. We have understood that now from these large global models that are constructed. And you haven't the faintest idea how things are influencing each other. And of course, by the time you're constructing such a model, you've lost the edge in terms of the parameters that are governing the system. You don't know how many there are. You're expanding in it, and you can't measure them very well. So look, in every subject you study. I mean, a physicist also studies a very large universe out there, but he whittles it down, or she whittles it down into a manageable problem for the issue at hand. And it's true in chemistry, it's true in biology, it's certainly in ecology. And ecology is in some sense the best parallel to economics, because our subject disciplines are very closely connected in every sense of the term, including sharing the common prefix eco, which has to do with house, home. And so the discipline which is closest to mine, economics that is ecology. And I've spent quite a bit of time in the past 40 years studying the subject with some of the world's great ecologists, Paul Ehrlich, Simon Levin, and many others. Yeah.
And that's an intersection that we'll certainly be moving on to in the following questions. The description that you have given to us of Cambridge University reminded me of how the economics department, since you mentioned Professor Bhaduri, and we have interviewed Professor Bhaduri earlier a couple of months back, and it was fascinating getting to read his responses. The economics department of Cambridge University, from Maurice Dobb to, say, Joanne Robinson, has always struck out for being heterodox in some way. So, since you mentioned Professor Baduri, while you were making the switch from mathematics to economics, what sort of an influence did this heterodoxy or this heterodox strand have on you while you were studying at Cambridge, especially with, say, special reference to the capital controversy at Cambridge, which I think occurred, started before you had commenced your PhD. What was the environment like at that time while you were making that switch to economics?
Oh, it's a very good question. For me, it is because it's actually, the thing is that I didn't really get to know many economists in the economics department when I was doing my PhD, for very personal and rather I don't know how far I should enter into it here in this conversation. Well, actually, I was in a hell of a hurry to get my PhD. I moved to economics in 1965, 65 to 66. I took a couple of courses, and the person who inspired me to move to economics was Sir James Mirrlees, who had himself moved from maths to economics. We used to belong to a discussion society called the Apostles, very well known discussion society here, and it was he who suggested to me that I should move to economics because he thought he suggested, he simply said, "Why don't you do economics?" So the 65-66 academic year, when I was learning economics, quote unquote, I was actually he supervised me, and then I did my PhD with him. Actually, I came out with very little understanding of economics at the end of the day, but I had a good PhD thesis, though, because it was a very mathematical piece of work and it suited my temperament. The subject suited my temperament. The reason I was in a huge hurry is that I'd met the young lady whom I got married to, and she was going to graduate in 1968, and I felt I ought to get my PhD by then, if we were to get married. The idea of living together without being married was unthinkable in those days. At least our parents would have been very shocked, I guess. So anyway, so that was the reason I worked very hard. I didn't very quickly, but I didn't meet any economists in the economics department. Not much anyway, because Mirrlees used to work from Trinity College, and I used to meet him at his office, and he guided me very well. He was a great guide. Sir James was. He never suggested a problem to me, so I had to develop my own problems, and that's probably why I enjoyed it very much, because I wasn't being told what to do, and he wouldn't even tell me how to solve the problems. But he was terrific in preventing me from making mistakes, taking the wrong route. He had an he was a fantastically brilliant guy, very, very brilliant, an original thinker. So I was very fortunate to have him. Now, regarding the economics department, because I was in a hurry to get my PhD, I did it in about 18 months from start to finish, in start to submitting. It was actually about 16 months, sorry. Yeah. So I didn't go to the economics department much, but as a result, I didn't really, this capital controversy just went over my head, so to speak. It was irrelevant for my work anyway. I was working on, I developed the idea of optimum population to extend Frank Ramsey's work on optimum savings. So I married demographics issues to the savings problem, and to create a unified story of capital accumulation and population and so forth. At that time, I can't help. I don't think I ever met Joan Robinson at work. I certainly never attended any of her lectures. So I can't really give you a good answer as to what's happening in the economics department, because I saw the economics department largely through the eyes of James Merlees. He was a young lecturer at that time, long before some time before he became a famous man. But he moved to Oxford about the time I finished my PhD in 1968 to take up a chair at a very early age. And then I lost touch with him. But none of the concerns of the economists at the economics department at that time had any effect on me, because I was somewhat detached from the economics department. Largely because if I went there, I didn't understand what they were talking about anyway. I mean, there's a lot of talk on Strafa prices and so forth, but I didn't understand what Strafa prices were until somebody pointed out to me that those prices without necessarily competition in it, or it was sort of, but then I found that in his book, he had assumed that the rate of profit was uniform across industries. So that foxed me, because you can only suppose that it's uniform if there's some form of competition going on, and there was no articulation of any institutions there. So it was sort of, it fell aside. It had no effect on me at all.
So since you mentioned your thesis, two things strike me. One, that since the title, which I'll read out, Population, Growth and Non-Transferable Capital, Investigations in the Theory of Optimum Economic Growth. And two things strike out to me as very interesting. One, that you're working on demography, and the other that you're working on growth theory. Now, both of them have become exceedingly relevant in today's times, especially with the recent Nobel Prize, which was on an institutionalist approach to economic growth. And since in countries like India, we are often troubled by the fact that our population continued to grow for a very long time, far longer than we would have liked it to grow. The first question that comes to my mind, what's your take on this, say, population conundrum in the 21st century, where we seem to have reached, where the population seems to have increased far beyond the carrying capacity of the world. So is Malthusian economics going to make a resurgence, or is, let's say, someone like Esther Bostrup's optimism likely to fructify? What do you think is likelier?
Well, you've asked us a sequence you've made some observations and then a sequence of a question. So there'll have to be a slightly long-winded in answering your thing. First of all, it started with my thesis title. It was on optimum population and sort of non-transferable capital. There were two completely separate issues. And they were actually, I strung up 3 chapters together, all right? It wasn't a thesis in the sense of that it could be published as a book. I published the chapters as papers, of course, in the Review of Economic Studies, but they weren't coherent. The history of it, since this is an Indian audience that I'm addressing, the non-transferable capital was totally inspired by Sukumar Chakravarti. He was a senior to me, of course, quite a bit, and he happens to be actually Omid Baduri's brother-in-law also, so they're sort of related. I was very fond of Sukumar and Sukumar Da, and I like to think, was very fond of me. In fact, he was very kind to me in many ways. He wrote a draft paper circulating at the time. I was looking for a problem to work on, which was on a Soviet model of planning, which was brought in by Professor Marlon Obis and formed the basis for the second 5-year plan in the 50s, I'm told. And it was a 2-sector non-shiftable capital. That was the whole idea, non-transferable. So that the idea was when investment is frozen into capital, then the capital becomes rigid. And if it's for producing consumer goods, the capital that's required for investment goods are separate. You can't transfer them. So that was the context. So there's a constraint in what you can do after you've invested, which led to some interesting problems. And I was following Sukumar. Sukumar had studied the Ramsey problem with such a production technology. And he gave not a completely satisfactory answer to the question. So I thought I could try and clean it up. And that was a transferable capital model of my PhD thesis. So this was Ramsey on a two-sector non-shiftable capital problem. Okay? So it was a capital accumulation problem. Now, that's nothing new in that, in the sense that a lot of people were at that time, particularly my own teacher, Merlis, was working on optimum savings. Okay, that was the problem that Ramsey had defined and taken quite a distant, way back in 1928. Ramsey's problem of savings over an extended horizon, in his case, of course, it was an infinite horizon, it was novel in 1928. And then the problem lay dormant, completely dormant, because pretty much soon after that, there was the Great Depression. People weren't concerned about the long run. They needed to fix the short run. So the problems of that type, of Ramsey's problem, fell by the wayside until it was rediscovered. And interestingly, to the extent that I understand the history of my subject, it was rediscovered by Sukumoy Chakravarti in a paper of 1962, which probably nobody reads now. But he got it from Tinbergen, by the way. I think Tinbergen knew the Ramsey work, and then Chakravarti was Tinbergen's student at The Hague. And he carried it and he wrote a beautiful paper in 1962, reintroducing the Ramsey problem without being able to do anything with it. He didn't do anything with it, but he noticed that that's the way we ought to think about planning problems. Okay? So then within a year or two, of course, people moved in and the Ramsey framework was extended beyond belief. I mean, it was all over the place. The late 60s were the time of Frank Ramsey's problem was much explored. Ken Arrow wrote a book with Mordecai Kutz in 1917, which the Ramsey framework of optimum savings was discussed, elaborated upon. And it became a routine thing. And once Merlis and Little showed how to use that for cost-benefit, developing the theory of cost-benefit analysis, well, then it became the center of attention for long-term developmental thinking, okay? The architecture of thinking about the long term. So that's how it went. Now, at the time I was doing my PhD, I speak now somewhat, I'm talking about now 67, 68, that period. I can't remember who asked me. I think it must have been James. I think it was James Mead. Yes, it definitely was James Mead. In a letter to me, he asked me, I was a PhD student. He said, everybody's working on optimum savings, but how does Ramsey's theory look like if population is also a control variable? In other words, fertility is a control variable, so that you can have public policy over child taxes or child subsidies or whatever, so to influence it. And I started sort of thinking, all right, savings is a control variable, fertility is a control variable. How about marrying the two? Because the optimum level of savings today for a society would depend on what forecast of human numbers there are. Okay, and then how much, if you're thinking of fertility decisions, then what the world looks like in the future, or is likely to look like in the future, should affect it. So the two are interconnected problems. So it seemed a very natural thing to marry the two into one. And that was part of my thesis. That was the other side of my thesis. The non-transferable capital was one side. I fixed up Sukumoy Chakravarti's problem nicely, I think, in one chapter. But then by the time I ended my PhD work, the chapter which took up the most space and my attention was the problem of optimum population and savings. So the Merlis advised me to think of fertility the same way as savings. So I married the two, and I still like to think it's one of the best papers I've ever written. It's published in the Review of Economic Studies within a year. Not many people took notice of it because demography is not part of the natural language of economists today. That is not true, by the way, in the past. Way back in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, demography was much more integrated with economic thinking, much more so than it is now. Anyway, that's the history of it. That's how I got involved in it. I found it absolutely fascinating because about the same time as I was working on it, and I wrote down the model, which was to say maximizing the discounted sum of total utility, total number of people plus times the per capita utility over time, and then choosing both the consumption, the accumulation rate, and the population development. It was really quite novel. At least in retrospect, it was novel. At that time, it wasn't very novel to me, largely because I didn't know the subject very well, so I didn't know what was new and was not so new. But the novelty really is, in my judgment now, which is much under stressed novelty of the problem is in typical decision theory, this classical decision theory, since it's an economics audience, there's no reason why I should avoid technicalities here. Your utility that you postulate, the utility function is unique up to a positive linear affine transformation. So there are two parameters defining the utility function, which is the scale and the scale, actually, yeah. The level of the utility doesn't matter because population is exogenous. But if population is not exogenous, then the level of utility matters because you're forced to ask, is life good or is it bad? See, if population is exogenous, it's going to be, numbers are going to be there no matter what. It's pointless asking, is life good or bad? All you can say is life is better or worse than today or yesterday, so forth, or across people. What you can't ask is life good, which is an absolute notion, because non-existence is not an option. Whereas if population is choosable, then it was forth you're asked, if the child that I have is likely to have a miserable life, should I create the child? That's a very natural question to ask, and so forth. So the level of utility matters. And so my chapter actually showed why it is critical. And the moment the population is endogenous in a model, you have to specify the zero of the utility function. So much later, I realized how important that the origin, the fixing of the origin is. And I've written quite a bit on it since, largely because I found that the great utilitarian philosopher Sidgwick got it wrong in his main chapter, misunderstood the notion of zero utility. So there's a philosophical literature as well, literature in ethics, where many of the philosophers have made a mistake. I think the mistake arises out of Sidgwick's error in his book. But I didn't know any of this, by the way, at that time. This came much later. But the novelty in my PhD thesis, if there was any, was to recognize that you need to specify the zero of the utility function the moment population is endogenous. By the way, the endogeneity doesn't mean that you're actually controlling population. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that if there is a policy, if a government has a policy which is going to affect households' choice of fertility decisions, the moment that happens, then the government will have to think about a zero of utility function. That's a non-trivial observation, by the way, but it sort of falls very naturally from the analysis. So that's how I got involved in it, and it has fascinated me as a normative, as a problem of ethics, of how to marry savings with fertility decision, and the value of new births, and so forth. And the second part of your question, sorry, I've overlooked the extended variety of a question. Even in my PhD thesis, I had the chapter on optimum population that I had. I'll give it to exactly how it went. The first model I wrote down for it had physical capital or produced capital, K, as we call it, and human numbers, N, let us call it that. And it had a production function which is linear homogeneous, as used to be usual. And when I solved the Ramsey problem with optimum population with it, I found that the optimum, it had some interesting features, but the main feature was there was going to be a steady state capital accumulation and population growing to infinity. Okay? And I didn't unnerve anybody because at that time in the 60s, everybody was assuming that population grows at an exponential rate. The whole of the literature on optimum savings was assuming that. Now, it sounds bizarre nowadays, I know from the younger generation's perspective, where the hell are all these people going to be fitting in and a finite, but nobody bothered about it at that time. However, at the same thesis, I then introduced a fixed factor, land. And I found that the entire story becomes very different. The optimum population goes to a finite limit. Capital accumulation ends because the constraint that the fixed factor imposes on production veers the optimum away from indefinite growth to a finite limit. That's in my PhD thesis. Now, I introduced land, which is an indestructible fixed factor, as it was postulated in my thesis, but that was not a limitation, because if you made it destructible, you still get the same result. You won't, of course, wish to destroy it because you're optimizing, but you'll still be limited by a finite bound that the land, the surface offers, that imposes on production possibilities. So your long run is going to be a stationary state. That's also in my thesis, and it was published in 1969. So that's, in a way, that must have, in many ways, influenced my subsequent work, since you're hinting at it as to how I got involved with my ecological interests. I think it stayed with me, the fact that introducing a fixed factor really transforms your story, even if you have unlimited capital accumulation possibilities, because you won't use those possibilities because they're not going to do very much for you. There will be diminishing returns to investment in produced capital because of that fixed factor. Now, so that was I think that's one influence I've had over my subsequent work, because I moved away from that kind of reasoning pretty fast. The last 40 years has been mostly devoted to developing ecological economics. But there was another influence that I've had, which, since you were kind enough to ask me what may have influenced me when I was young, I had a fantastic geography teacher in the school that I mentioned, Rajkot, which is where I did my secondary, where I did my matriculation exam in those days. It was grade 10, in Benares. And my geography teacher taught geography to me to his classes, as an analytical subject, not as tell me which cities, on a blank canvas, plot where Delhi is or where Allahabad is. He wasn't doing it that way. He was actually teaching geography as an ecologist, actually, although at that time that term wasn't used. And I think I sometimes wonder why I didn't do geography as in my undergraduate work, because I was drawn to the subject. He was such a fantastic teacher. I think I was in many ways a natural geographer, if you like, but I didn't take that option up. It didn't occur to me. But that had a great influence, subsequent influence, I think. But I had a delayed reaction to my classes I took from Mr. Vishwanathan, who taught me geography in Rajkot in Varanasi. So that these were the backgrounds which led me to study. Excuse me, I have a telephone call. Sveta, I'm on a Zoom. Can you call back in half an hour? Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, so I think those are the influences I've had which made me move towards ecology over the long run.
The one thing that you mentioned about, especially about land, struck to me is very important because as part of your methodology, the way I understand it, is to move away from, let's say, GDP as a flow variable to understanding growth, but to also look at stocks. Now, related to this, I have a question pertaining to your methodology, of course, but also how you view sort of this recent Nobel Prize in economics that was awarded to Asimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, where they talk about institutions as extractive and inclusive institutions as sort of the prime mover of growth. So in their book, they mention in a chapter how other theories are wrong, that theories that don't work. Yet, factor endowments, of which, let's say, land is a frontier, or other natural resources, coal, for instance, which was very crucial to the British Industrial Revolution, as well as to Industrial Revolution elsewhere, and which is gradually being depleted, also seems to be a very crucial determinant of growth. So, in this current Anthropocene epoch, do you think that this rejection of factor endowments is a crucial intellectual error in sort of the way economic growth is now being viewed by new institutional economists? What's your take on them?
It's a very, very lovely question, I must say. That's a highly intelligent question. A tough one. I'm not sure I can give you an adequate answer because I haven't thought a lot about it. Sort of like any practicing economist, you work on a problem you don't. I think it's rubbish to think that everything's on institutions and institutions alone. I mean, we like to think so. We're economists naturally because that's the thing that you can guide. And the imposition of the external world over which we don't really have that much control, can't make, is a bit of a nuisance. We like to think that we can overcome it. So the new institutional economics is not all that new. I mean, we've had many institutional. I mean, there was people like who was this economic historian who
Douglas North?
Sorry,
Douglas North.
Douglas North was an institutional economist. So obviously, goes without saying institutions are important. Goes without saying that. I mean, that's trivial observation. They're extremely important. But the idea that you can overcome, that there are no other constraints, that you can design an institution to solve any kind of problem and go for any kind of prosperity, that at some fundamental level is, of course, rubbish. It just can't happen. I mean, if the Earth was the size of the moon, we would have had a different economic possibilities. Come on. So it's a kind of, I think this obsession with institutions, or all that putting it, that's all that matters. They of course matter, but to say that that's all that matters is a kind of an Enlightenment thinking, actually, that somehow we are above the humanity is above the natural world. It's kind of a, today, particularly to have that view is very odd, given what we see is happening with biodiversity loss, species extinctions at a furious rate, shrunken wetlands, disappearing forests, and the rate of biodiversity loss is just, it's extraordinary now. To think that, now you can say, of course, that's happening because of bad institutions. You can always do that by saying that, you can say that, that if you can cure that, then the world will look after itself. There is truth in that. Of course, there is truth in that. But we can also say, of course, if the human numbers were fewer, there would have been less of a pressure. You could say that. But that's not politically as correct as saying that institutions are at fault, rather than maybe that. So, yes, obviously we operate with the physical constraints or biological constraints that institution can't override biology. It can maneuver itself across biological constraints, but there are limits to how much that can happen. So it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. I don't think that's the right way of, at least that's not the way I see these things. There are moments where people feel very optimistic. And you mentioned Esther Bosrup, and she was, in a way, reacting to Malthusian pessimism, and the new ecological economics is trying to come to terms with Bosrup's, not coming to terms with, but to qualify Bosrup by saying, of course, there are things that we can do to expand the possibilities, but beyond a point, it is nature which will set constraints. And I think in many ways, since you've asked a very deep question, and I don't have a very easy answer to them because I don't have one, an answer easy or not easy. But I think in some ways if one was to think about the intellectual history, we've had an extraordinarily, let me put it this way, it's some of the pieces that I sent you, I think a few weeks ago, will have this note. We've really gone through a 70-year exceptional period for the human economy. 1950 onwards, say now it's 75 years, but in that we've had if you plot pretty much all the kinds of indices that we use to talk about economic progress, say GDP per capita, you will find that, or life expectancy at birth, you will find that it's pretty flat with slight increase globally. I mean, I'm talking about global figures now. Slight increase from about 1700, 1750 onwards, until it really takes off about 1950. It's almost like the hockey stick curve that you see when you look at carbon concentration in the atmosphere. That from 1950 onwards, there was a huge increase. Population numbers was, of course, a good approximate indicator too. In 1950, world population was about 2.5 billion. Today, it's 8.1 billion plus. So there's been a huge increase over the past 70 years. During this period, if you freeze your attention to that, you will say that we've never had it so good. The average person in the world, that is, ignoring inequalities. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the average, global average. It's been an amazingly good period. Now, if you shrink at it, you feel that, gosh, if this is not exceptional, we can just continue that way. But at the flip side of that same story, if you look at the state of the global environment, that is to say, the ecology of it, you see that's the reverse. That is an incredible decline in productivity of ecosystems. Disappearance of species, of course, is the highlight of it. Okay, and of course, carbon concentration is one manifestation of that. Carbon concentration in the atmosphere is only one manifestation of the ecological overreach. So you can look at the state of the world from two perspectives. One side of the coin is this incredible improvement in most indicators of life, of societal life at the global level. On the other side is an incredible pressure on the natural world, which is ruinous in the sense of backfiring on our attempts at human progress. Now, if you ignore the latter, everything looks marvelous. And if you ignore the former, everything looks extremely depressing, right? And so we need to have some kind of an understanding of how each side affects the other. And that's not been happening in mainstream economics. In particular, you asked about GDP. Of course, GDP doesn't recognize depreciation of capital. So it doesn't look at the other side of that coin in the first place. So you've got a completely wrong index for measuring progress. Now, you mentioned that I was focusing attention on stocks. The reason is, it is an important point, in my judgment, because, and you're right to point this out, because flows don't tell you anything about the future. It's stocks which do. You hand over stocks to the next generation. You hand over rights to flows to the next generation, but those rights to the flows are the stocks. So if you have a refrigerator, you know you'll get a flow of services from that refrigerator. If you have an automobile, you know you'll have a flow of services from that automobile for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever, or so many passenger miles. But it is the stocks which convey economic possibilities. And the reason, the underlying analysis, which asks you to look at stocks in national accounts rather than flows, is based on a theorem that my friend and colleague, Carl-Johan Mailer, and I proved 25 years ago, I guess 2000 is when we published our paper, which we showed that instead of income, we ought to be measuring wealth. And when I say wealth, I mean not only stocks of manufactured capital and human capital, but natural capital as well. So the social worth of all the assets that a community has. And that's the thing that needs to be measured, because that tells us whether the future is promising or it isn't. It's a tight theorem, by the way. It says that if wealth increases, then human well-being increases, and vice versa. The two are two sides of the same coin. And when I say human well-being, I mean welfare across the generations. Okay. So the Brundtland Commission reports recommendation that sustainable development should be development where a path of development in which each generation hands over at least as much of stock assets they had themselves inherited. That fits in very nicely with this theorem. In fact, it just says that precisely that. It says if you hand over the value of those assets, at least as much as you had inherited yourself, then you're giving them opportunities and therefore the possibilities of progress, at least as much. Now, you can't, if you can, this is wealth. So you could have increasing wealth while increasing the produced capital and human capital, but degrading natural capital. You can do that to a point, obviously. But beyond the point, then the value of that natural capital becomes so high that at the margin, it becomes costlier and costlier to substitute away from natural capital to produce capital. That's pretty straightforward, intuitively, how that happens. So what we proved was precisely what Carl-Johan Mailer and I proved was precisely that, yes, it is wealth, which is the measure of well-being, that's for sure. But that if you have eaten too much into natural capital, or if you continue doing that, then the cost becomes higher and higher and higher, and you may not be able to do it. Which is why in my more recent work, I have, at least for the global economy, I've been concentrating on the natural capital side, because that's the one which is really in danger. I now mean the oceans, I mean the atmosphere, of course. Now, the carbon problem in the atmosphere is the only part of this complexity of issues that I'm mentioning that comes up for airing all the time. But that's only one asset, namely the atmosphere as a sink for our carbon emissions. We have the oceans, we have the ecosystems, wetlands, rangelands, mangrove forests, you name it. All these ecosystems which are under threat, they should be studied now with equal attention. Because if they're under threat, basically the productive base of the economy is declining, even as you're constructing buildings and roads and factories and so forth. So it's that complexity of things that, in some senses, has been the center of my attention for the last 20, 25 years. But that theorem is, what led to the theorem was Mailer's and my interest in seeing what is it that we should, it's all very well to say GDP is a bad idea. I mean, GDP growth is not a good measure, not a bad idea, it's not a good measure of progress. So then the right question is, what is? What is the right measure? And what we showed was that it is wealth. Wealth inclusive of natural capital. Yeah.
In the one thing that comes to mind, since you've mentioned that you have demonstrated rather how we tend to have a very parochial conception of growth when we just look at GDP numbers, which sort of undermines the precarity of all this growth, given what is depleted behind it. Recently, former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh passed away, and in the aftermath of that, there's been a renewed debate on the impact of the 1991 liberalization reforms and between economic growth and sustainability, and wherein you have one side that says that capitalism and its expansionary nature is inadequate to deal with climate change. Now, some people propose degrowth strategies in response to that. That all right, you have some countries that are very rich and they need not become richer, and they should perhaps focus on degrowth. Now, how do you view this dichotomy between growth and degrowth in light of, let's say, the
Yeah.
precarity of quote unquote growth in our times?
Thank you for asking this question. It's damn difficult to answer in a way which is convincing to your audience. But I don't usually think in terms of strategies. It's not my natural way of thinking. That doesn't mean it's wrong or right or anything like that. It's just that I've never found it very useful to think about, should we go for growth or should we go for degrowth or anything like that. I'm a macroeconomist by temperament, so I start at the bottom, which is, have we got the prices right? Are the prices that are reflected in our transactions, implicit or explicit, depending on whether it's non-market or market transaction, are they picking up social values? That is to say, are they shadow prices, or are they hugely distorted through the phenomenon of externalities, which you're familiar with, right? So now, externalities used to be, when I was a student, the rarity to be discussed. So in textbooks, you'll find it in chapter 24. The fourth final chapter of the textbook will have something on externalities. But now, with the human population and the size of the global economy being what it is, externalities are not a rarity. They're actually the thing, the missing from transactions, the effects that our activities have on others, which are not paid for, if you like, or not taken into account when the transactions are created, undertaken. So they're the real thing, and if that's the real thing, then the open trade or free trade, that's a very dangerous thing, because if you've got the more trade expands, if there are externalities attached to each transaction, then the externalities expand as well. So but I'm rather hesitant to talk about, is free trade good or free trade bad. Any trade is bad if it's connected with externalities for which are not being paid for. And if there are beneficial externalities, then there is an undersupply of these benefits through trade. And if these externalities are adverse, then there's an oversupply of adverse externalities. So in a sense, catchwords like, open trade is bad and so forth, I have less sympathy with that strain of thinking, because we really need to think in terms of whether the institutions are adequate to handle these externalities, as to whether they're being internalized. Now, I think there are many, many messages we can take away from this. So let me give you one which may be of particular interest to your audience in India. I'm pretty convinced now that when poor countries export primary products to richer countries, or it doesn't have to be richer countries, when they export primary products, they're losing wealth at the margin. And the reason they do that is that the primary products are ecology dependent. They're ecological products, from forests, from wetlands, from grasslands, from mangrove forests, and so forth. Okay, say shrimps would be a good example. You're exporting shrimps, all right. But the export price is not going to pick up the external damage that the shrimp farm inflicts on neighboring waters. Okay, they don't, as a matter of fact, which is another way of saying that the export price is too low from the exporting country's point of view, because neighboring fishermen are being adversely affected when shrimp farms are created which means, another way of putting it is that, to come back to the theorem that the language that Mailer and I tried to introduce, which is always look at the impact on wealth, the export of shrimps from, say, Bangladesh or Thailand is essentially an economic activity in which the exporting country is losing some wealth without being paid for it. So it's sort of leaking wealth out through the externality that I just now mentioned. Now, if you put it that way, it looks pretty alarming to the exporting nation. It will say, you mean every time I export shrimp, I'm losing wealth? The answer is yes, you are, because you're not being compensated for the damage that your own inhabitants are experiencing from the export. But I'm of course converting it into a wealth formulation because it is the right way of thinking. So these theorems they're not abstract theorems, because try telling that to the international, the trade organization who want open trade, expanding trade. Expansion of trade carries with it an expansion of the adverse externalities that go with the trade. And if the externalities are not curtailed, are not dampened, then you have a bad news that comes with the expansion of trade. So you see, it does have huge implications on the way we see some of these big policy thoughts, namely, is trade good? Well, of course, at one level, it is good. But at another level, be aware that you could carry with it some damages, which if you don't take those damages into account, then you are hurting some people, maybe everybody. So that's how I like to do policy analysis, rather than having a big agenda like, I'm against exports, or I'm in favor of that.
And when it comes to policy analysis, you've come up with one of the most seminal documents that I think every policymaker will have to refer to in the future, the Dasgupta review that was commissioned by the UK government. So I have a question relating to that review. You've mentioned in this conversation as well, you've hinted at the fact that we have a very utilitarian understanding of biodiversity. So we lament the fact that, all right, carbon concentration is increasing, and that has impact on certain ecosystem services. But we aren't concerned about, let's say, aspects of biodiversity that may not be of any immediate economic use to us. So while working on the review, what sort of an approach did you take? What was it like when the government approached you to work on the review? And what do you think policymakers should take away from it while they are working on framing policy for their own countries?
Wow. I can't really answer your last question because different countries have different needs. At the global level, I think one of the things that, starting from the back to the earlier part of your question, I think one of the things I'd like them to take away is this amount of time I spent coming up with an argument as to why we ought to take the oceans seriously. The oceans nobody discusses it, very few people discuss it. It's the atmosphere as a sink for our carbon, which is always the global common property resource we'll think of. The oceans, open seas, that is, the high seas, are usually ignored. And yet, one thought that I've had was that you could raise, one of the proposals in my review was that globally we could raise a huge amount of money annually from taxing the traffic that takes place in the open seas, the oil tankers and the freight that's carried across the oceans, Atlantic, Indian, and the Pacific. Now, suppose, and those are common property resources. They are not private, beyond the 200-mile EEZ, exclusive economic zone. These are common property resources. So the global community has a right to extract rents from its use. And that could raise billions and billions of dollars a year easily into the treble digit billions probably. And that could be used for very, very many environmental problems, but it's not, because it's open access. It's a tragedy of the commons that are taking place at the oceans. That was one of the proposals in it. There are other proposals, but I, on the whole, wanted to give a unified analysis of ecological economics. I mean, apply ecological economics as best as I could to the global environment to show how to reconstruct economics by taking natural capital seriously. Typically, we think of human capital and produced capital as the two engines, two factors affecting economic possibilities. That's how we teach the subject, graduate courses. And then that's extremely important, because today's students like yourselves will be tomorrow's decision makers. And today's decision makers were yesterday's students. So the link between policy, decision making at the national and international levels, and the economics that you are studying and the economics that I study and write on is very close. It's a matter of time shift. Many of you will be running departments in the next few years. And so it really is important that this dialogue, this transfer of understanding improves with time and not embedded in a framework in which natural capital or nature is absent. And it remains absent. Up until very recently, I used to have a rather interesting conversation with friends in the Indian government, old friends of mine who were, I'm going to say until recently, I mean, say 20, 25 years ago. That it's not that recent, but at my age, yes, that was the other day. So I would talk about these questions, and they would say, well, yes, Partha, you're quite right, of course, but we in India, we need to develop. So that was a sort of a conversation stopper, because of course the development doesn't require any attention to the ecosystems. Now, one thing that used to puzzle me a lot, and I wrote quite a bit on this actually, but those pieces of mine never really had any found any resonance amongst readers, was that I felt in many ways that the dismissal or neglect of nature in economic modeling has been hugely helped by the fact that those who write on it are privileged people in society who have never actually seen an ecosystem producing goods and services. We sort of think of ecosystems as luxury goods, where you go sailing or a place of beauty. And it's a sort of so you can somebody could then say, well, it's all very well for you to think about the beauty of the beach, but, we need to develop. So this is a luxury we can't afford or something. But the productivity of nature, the idea that nature is a productive asset on which the entire human economy is embedded, is something only those who live in nature, some of the poorest people in the world, really appreciate. It'll be the fishermen, the woodcutters, the people who live in the forests. They're the ones who know how dependent their livelihood is, their whole life is on nature. On their nature, that's a local ecosystem. Those of us who sit in desks in urban centers, of course, we're buying finished products. We don't see the damn thing at its raw. So it was possible for us to have feigning this attitude that this is for the birds, this is for, it's not, it's the poorest who are, try and talk about nature to somebody who lives in the Amazon forest. He will laugh at you because his whole life depends on his entire set of activities are built around natural capital. And you don't have to go to the Amazon, you go up north into the forests of Assam, into what we call the indigenous populations, and they will tell you how that they're 100% of there. And the applied economist in India I admire most was somebody who died a few years ago, Narpath Jodha, who he was just pioneering applied economist of the Commons of Hyderabad. And he asked a very reasonable question, which is how much of a household's daily activities are embedded in the natural capital, the local natural capital. And he came up with pretty good estimates. I mean, interesting estimates, 30%, 40% of household income comes from the commons around them. He was concerned with the commons, I guess. And he and I got on very well. He taught me a lot over the years. I think I remember writing a forward to his collection of essays, which he published about 12 years ago. Anyway, but he was talking about the commons in India, in Hyderabad, I guess, semi-arid areas of India. But if you ask the same question of somebody who lives in the forest, the indigenous populations of, in the Himalayan, the forests, the foothills of the Himalayas, it'll be near 100%. A bit of trade with the rest of the world, maybe, but mostly it's down there. So if we think about those economies, then of course nature is absolutely paramount. We are displaced from it because we get finished products. We get the value added, so to speak. But at the end of the day, the chain is from there. And so the leakages that take place when goods are exported from the primary products are exported from the source to the final scene, those leakages are extremely, to me, intellectually very interesting. So when we talk about institutions, you asked me after institutions, that's where I think the action is, where we should be studying the institutional leakages which are affecting our relationship with the world around us. I don't know if this makes sense, but that's how I see things.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for such an in-depth response. Do you think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience before we close this session?
Of course.
Right. So the first question is from Anshu, and since he has his camera on, I'll ask him to unmute and ask it directly. Anshu, go ahead.
Right. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Pushkar. Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. It was really wonderful listening to your conversation with Pushkar, who he asked really wonderful questions as well. Your conversation reminded me of behavioral economics, actually.
Sorry?
And I'm talking about your conversation reminded me of behavioral economics. Thaler and Kahneman and some of them people who talked about nudging, for instance, to sort of suggest interventions in guided behavioral making. I just wanted to ask you what your view might be on the fact that these sort of measures can have on sort of addressing global climate issues and some of these things, particularly when it comes to behavioral changes to biodiversity or climate and some of these things. Because from my own experience, the economic community is a bit divided on behavioral economics as well and to its effectiveness. So I just wanted to ask you what you might think on it.
I may not be a good person to ask since I've not been much involved in the developments in behavioral economics, but actually I'm currently drafting a paper on it as it happens, on aspects of behavioral anomalies that have been observed. But I think we overdo the prospect of nudge. I mean, after all these years, we haven't got too many examples of nudge. I think in many ways where we ought to be concentrating, which we haven't done, I've begun to write quite extensively on it, but I don't really have very much new to say. Once you have the thought, if you write down a model, it comes out really so fast that I feel very embarrassed about even pointing out that we forget how, I mean, okay, so this is a serious question you've asked because it requires a serious answer, demands a serious answer. If you think about what you have learned about consumer behavior, you're told the story of egotists. The consumer is an egoist. There are some econometric reasons for this bias. which has to do with indigeneity of preferences, but ignore that for the moment. I mean, I don't see why limitations of econometrics should delay progress in economic thinking, because that's technology rather than. But it is really remarkable how we have ignored anthropologists in recognizing that we are hugely influenced by our neighbors. We are influenced by people we talk to. We are influenced by society at large. Of course, we've been influenced when we were growing up by our parents and the society we lived in. But to an extent, you might say, well, that influence is in some sense endogenous. You can correct for that. You can take that into account for your future behavior. But what about your lateral influence, the influence that you have on neighbor? It's something that I've written now, I'm writing quite a lot on, because it's something that has been really undervalued. Ken Arrow and I wrote a couple of pieces on it just a few years ago, one on the Veblen effect and its effect on savings. We published a paper on that. But I think the Veblen effect is less interesting than the effect of mimicking how we like to behave like our compatriots. Otherwise, you can't explain fashions and fads. You know, why suddenly it becomes fashionable to have flared trousers and then it disappears. It can only happen because it's like a contagious disease, not a disease, sort of, it's contagious. The behavior is contagious, okay, each influencing the other. Now, if you introduce others' influence on, like physicists do over locally interacting systems, which is exactly what it is, then you've got something very interesting, because you've got these externalities which are local, but they can spread. So each locality is influencing the other next door. So something that happens here could ripple off. And you see that in fashion all the time, okay, how it takes off. That has been really undervalued. And the trick is not so much nudging, because nudging doesn't really pick up the essence of it, which is somehow the other to take advantage of the inflationary tendencies of fashion. That is, it sort of shoots up. So you sort of try something which will then eject. We see that, of course, in the world of ideas in a big way, when some ideas take off, and then hundreds of papers are published on that idea. Others don't, so forth. So that's not quite nudging. It's because nudging could be very contained. Could be sort of, I only nudge my next door neighbor. But it's the possible explosion of a movement. And I think there is something in that. And we've seen that in many cases. I think climate change recognition or acceptance and then recognition of climate change is something which is what's happened in about 15, 20 years. Even as late as 2005, I think, Time magazine carried a headline saying, take climate change seriously, very seriously. I mean, it was still being questioned. That's only 20 years ago. But now I suppose it'll be somebody will be very embarrassed. It'll be sort of really an outlier on that. You can't predict how fast ideas are going to move. And the only thing we can do as economists is to be as convincing and via being as honest as we can with the data that we have at our disposal and our limited understanding, making it clear how limited it is, then to propose, to urge people to take seriously. Now, in many ways, what we've been discussing here, or at least some of the questions that you've been asking me, has been over the fact that I've tried, over these years. I'm so sorry. There's another phone call. I'm sorry. Can you call back in about 10 minutes? What I've been trying to do over the past 30 years or so has been really to try and introduce nature into economic thinking about economic possibilities ahead for the global community as well as, of course, local ones, goes without saying. That's hard. It's not easy to shift a infrastructure, which is like a capital asset, which is a bit sort of, it's more clay than putty, if you see what I mean. intellectual ideas are more clayish than pottyish, because if they are pottyish, then of course it would be bad if it were pottyish, because then you wouldn't know where it's going to go. But you need to have some pride in possession of an idea, and so there should be resistance, goes without saying. But on the other hand, this resistance shouldn't be a fashion. And certain types of problems in economics, to extend the question, are very hard to introduce into economic thinking because it's not politically correct, or it's not, it raises sensitive issues for some communities and so forth. So we have to be aware of that as well. Some of us, I'm particularly a great advocate of freedom of speech and thought. So the question doesn't rise. Everything is up for grabs. You should be allowed to discuss anything openly. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. You're shown to be wrong. But to suppress thought is a very bad idea. One of the difficulties that these things raise is how many ideas are suppressed, are not expressed, and we would not know that. It's a bit like, if we spent a lot of time over adverse externalities, right? Because those who work on natural capital these days, we worry about adverse externalities. But think about now beneficial externalities, works of charity, for example, people who work in charities and doing good things and so forth. But we don't measure how many good things are not done because there aren't incentives to do it. Or, as in the case of people who work in charities, who are charitable, they on the whole like to, part of being a charitable disposition is to remain hidden. They don't want to advertise that they're really, because that would, in some sense, reduce the worth of what they're doing. So anyway, there's a measurement problem there too. We may be underestimating the amount of work that is done for the benefit of others. And it's also possible that because it's hard to reward good behavior as opposed to punishing bad behavior, harder to, do you see what I mean? Because punishing bad behavior is less costly than to rewarding good behavior. So in a sense, there is an asymmetry there. So it's a puzzling thing as to how to get the ball rolling. You were talking about nudge. I was sort of gravitating to the point that maybe nudge is a bit too simplistic way of thinking about a problem, which is much deeper as to how to create a balance between doing good and minding your own business and getting on with your own life. It's a delicate issue, and I don't think we understand it very well.
Right. Thank you so much, sir, for that response. I think the other questions in the chat box have somewhere or the other been dealt with. And since we've been receiving many phone calls, I think let's end our conversation here, unless someone has a question that hasn't been covered at all. I don't think there's any such question in the chat box. So, I mean, Rajneesh, you can deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Caucus, the discussion forum of a Hindu college, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta for gracing us with his presence and sharing his invaluable insights on the critical subject of the economics of biodiversity. From studying your research paper in the general elective in economics every semester here at Delhi University to finally interacting with you face to face, you are overwhelming. So it's truly an honor to host you whose pioneering work has profoundly shaped the global discourse on sustainable development and environmental economics. Your thought-provoking sessions today has enlightened us on the nuanced interconnections between economic growth, biodiversity, and sustainability. It has also reminded us of our collective responsibility to rethink and reshape the way we value and use natural resources. Your wisdom and knowledge have left an indelible mark on all of us, and we look forward to further opportunities to learn from you. Once again, thank you so much for your time and invaluable insights. This evening has truly been an intellectual treat. I'd also like to thank all our members and participants for joining us today. Let's continue to work towards a more informed and interconnected world. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure
Thank
to
you so
meet
much,
you all.
sir.